Hi everyone, my name is Monique, and today I'm going to be showing you how to play a game called Sky Team, designed by Luc Rémond, illustrated by Eric Hibbler and Adrian Reeve, and published by Scorpion Masqué, who are helping sponsor this video. In Sky Team, 2 players act as pilots, in charge of landing a commercial airliner over the course of 7 rounds. Players will need to work together to place their dice with minimal communication in order to land the plane safely and efficiently. If this is your first time playing, I'll be showing you how to play the basic game detailed in the landing procedure rulebook. Once you've won your first game, you can choose a scenario from the flight log that includes more advanced rules and modules to incorporate. I'll be teaching each module towards the end of the video, so feel free to jump directly to that section. But for now, let's start with setup. To set up the basic game, place the control panel in between the players, who should ideally be seated side by side, and place the airplane access disc into its space at the top of the control panel with its arrow pointing towards the black triangle. Then, place all 10 switch tokens covering each green light. Next, place the blue aerodynamics marker on the speed gauge between the 4 and 5, and the orange marker between the 8 and 9. Place the red brake marker on the brake track to the left of the 2. Afterwards, find the altitude track and slide it into the top right slot of the control panel with the green and yellow side face up and the number 6000 visible in the screen. Then, place a reroll token on each reroll icon on the track. Next, slide the Montreal Trudeau approach track into the top left slot, making sure the clouds are visible in the screen, and place an airplane token on each airplane traffic icon on the track. Place the 3 coffee tokens into a reserve by the side of the board. The player sitting on the blue side of the control panel plays as the pilot and takes the 4 blue dice as well as the blue player screen. The player sitting on the orange side plays as the co-pilot and takes the 4 orange dice and player screen, and now you're ready to play. In Sky Team, players must work together to safely land a plane by assigning their dice to various areas of the plane's control panel. Each game is played over the course of 7 rounds, and each round consists of 3 phases, starting with the strategy discussion and dice rolls phase. At the start of each round, players may openly discuss their strategies for the round prior to rolling their dice. Players may discuss specific goals they have in mind, such as which areas to focus on, but players may never discuss the dice, including specific die values. It is up to you as the pilot or co-pilot to make these decisions for yourself during the round. Once discussions are complete, if there's a reroll token in the current altitude space, move it to the available supply area in the top left section of the control panel. Each player now rolls their dice behind their player screens, making sure the other player cannot see them. And from now on, no talking is allowed. Players must remain completely silent until the end of the round unless they need to clarify or correct rules errors. Afterwards, move on to the next phase, which is dice placement. During this phase, players will be taking turns placing 1 die each on a free space of the control panel, starting with the player as indicated by the arrow in the current altitude screen, which in this example is the pilot. The control panel is divided into 7 different areas, and each space shows a color and/or number requirement when placing dice there. Only the pilot can place dice in blue spaces and the co-pilot in orange spaces, but either player can place dice in spaces with both colors. Spaces with specific numbers require the corresponding numbered die to be placed there, and spaces with numbers separated by a slash give you the option of either value. In addition, there are 4 mandatory action spaces that are indicated by this symbol. Each round, players must assign 2 of their dice, one on the axis and the other on the engine, though they do not need to be the first dice placements. If, at the end of a round, any of these 4 spaces are empty, players lose the game immediately. Let's discuss each section of the plane, starting with the axis. The axis controls the direction your plane tilts as it flies. The first die placed here has no immediate effect. As soon as the second die is placed, turn the axis arrow towards the higher valued die a number of spaces equal to the difference between the 2 dice. If both dice have the same value, the axis does not move. If the arrow ever points at or moves past the X on either side, then the plane goes into a spin and you immediately lose the game. It's important to note that the axis does not reset from round to round, and in order to win the game, the plane must be completely horizontal again by the end of the last round. The engines determine how far the plane advances along the approach track. Similar to the axis, the first die placed has no effect. As soon as the second die is placed, add up the 2 die values, which equal the plane's speed, and compare it to the aerodynamics markers on the speed gauge. If the sum is greater than the orange marker, advance the track by 2 spaces. If it's between the two markers, advance by 1 space, and if the sum is less than the blue marker, do not advance at all. These markers will move several times throughout the game, as you'll see later, but you'll always compare the plane's speed to the position of these markers when placing the second die. There are also a number of airplane tokens on certain spaces of the approach track. If ever you have to advance when there are tokens in the current position space, you collide with another airplane and immediately lose the game. To avoid this, you can delay advancement on the approach track, but eventually you'll need to remove all of these tokens by assigning dice to the next action space called the radio. The radio allows you to communicate with the control tower by placing a die of any value in a space of your color. The co-pilot has 2 spaces available each round, while the pilot only has 1. After placing a die, starting with the current position, count a number of spaces up the approach track equal to your die value, and remove 1 airplane token there. All airplane tokens must be removed from the approach track before the end of the game in order to win. At some point during the flight, the pilot needs to start deploying the landing gear. Placing a die in any of these 3 spaces requires a specific value, but you may place these dice in any order. In a real airplane, deploying the landing gear increases drag, slowing down the aircraft. To simulate this, when placing a die, flip the switch to show the green light, and then advance the blue aerodynamics marker 1 space. This increases the value range necessary in order to progress on the approach track when activating the engines. Once a switch has been flipped, placing a die in its space will have no effect for the rest of the game. And in order to win, all 3 switches must be turned on by the end of the game. Throughout the journey, the co-pilot will also need to deploy the flaps, increasing the plane's lift and wind resistance. The 4 spaces in this section also require a specific die value, but unlike the landing gear, the flaps must be deployed in order from top to bottom. Similar to the landing gear, the flaps also slow down the aircraft due to an increase in lift. When placing a die, flip the switch to show the green light and advance the orange aerodynamics marker 1 space. All 4 switches must be turned on by the end of the game in order to win, which means the aerodynamics markers will be in this position by the end of the game, making it impossible to advance by 2 spaces in 1 round. So make sure to avoid deploying all of your flaps too early if you know you'll need to move fast. And of course, we have the brakes. It is up to the pilot to deploy the brakes by assigning a die with the indicated value and immediately advancing the red brake marker 1 space. The brakes must be deployed in order from left to right, but you are not required to deploy them all. Although, the more you deploy, the easier it'll be to land the plane in the final round, as we'll see later. Now, at certain points throughout the game, players may not have the most ideal dice values to assign during the round. Fortunately, there are a couple of ways in which you can modify them. One way is by spending coffee tokens to help you concentrate. Players start the game with no coffee tokens in their supply, so in order to gain these, either player must assign a die of any value to one of the 3 spaces in the concentration section. After placing a die, immediately place a coffee token in one of the 3 available spaces. Coffee tokens can be spent by either player to increase or decrease their die value by 1, and you can spend up to as many tokens on 1 die as you have available. Spent coffee tokens go back into a general supply, ready to be generated again. Unspent coffee tokens will remain from round to round, but it's important to note that die values can only be changed to numbers between 1 and 6, and die values do not loop, so subtracting 1 from a 1 value die does not change it into a 6 and vice versa. In addition, at any time during the round, players may spend any available reroll tokens to allow both players to reroll any number of unassigned dice behind their screen once. As soon as players have assigned all 8 dice, the round ends and players may speak again. Unless this is the final round, move on to the end of round phase. At the end of each round, the plane descends by 1,000 feet. Advance the altitude track by 1 space, retrieve your dice, and continue on to the next round. If after advancing the altitude track, the airport symbol is in the current position screen and the airplane is in the current altitude screen, this means you've arrived at the destination airport right as your plane is about to touch down, signaling the final round of the game. Now, there are a couple of special circumstances that you might find yourselves in. If the airport is ever in the current space when you have to advance the track, you've overshot your destination and immediately lose the game. If the airport image is not yet in the current position screen when the airplane is in the current altitude screen, unfortunately, you've crash landed before reaching the airport and you immediately lose the game. If the airport is in the current position screen, but the airplane image isn't in the current altitude screen, this means that you are above the airport, but the runway isn't ready yet. You'll need to place your dice strategically in order to delay and avoid advancing further until the end of the 7th round. While you're still required to assign dice to the 4 mandatory action spaces during the final round, the pilot will now also need to apply the brakes. During the final round, when placing the second die in the engine section, instead of comparing the plane's speed to the aerodynamics markers, players compare it to the brakes. Even though it is the pilot's job to set the brake limits, both players must work together to make sure the speed, which is the sum of both dice, is less than the brake value. If not, the plane was unable to stop on the runway, and you immediately lose the game. In addition to applying the brakes, the final round is also the last opportunity for players to move all areas of the control panel into their victory conditions. At the end of the final round, if there are no airplane tokens on the approach track, all flaps and landing gear switches show the green light, the airplane's axis is completely horizontal with the arrow pointing at the black triangle, and the plane's speed is less than the strength of the brakes, congratulations, because you've successfully landed the plane and you win the game. At this point, you have everything you need to embark on your first flight to Montreal. As soon as you've successfully completed the basic scenario, feel free to return to this video and join me as we explore the advanced scenarios and modules that come with the game. After you've successfully landed your plane in Montreal, you may now choose from one of the 20 scenarios included in the flight log, as well as additional scenarios that can be found on Scorpion Masqué's website. Each scenario is color-coded depending on the level of difficulty, with green indicating an easier, more routine landing, all the way up to black, indicating the most difficult, heroic landings. Each scenario also contains a number of icons, corresponding with additional modules and special abilities to incorporate when playing, and each time you successfully complete a scenario, make sure to check off the circle in the top left to show that you've completed it. To set up each scenario, follow the basic game setup, but instead of the Montreal approach track, make sure to use the one corresponding with the name and color of the chosen scenario. The skies are much busier in these scenarios, so make sure to find the traffic die and set it nearby. In these scenarios, you'll notice that the approach tracks have a new icon that represents an increase in air traffic. If there are any traffic icons in the current position screen at the start of a round, roll the traffic die for each icon present and add an airplane token to the corresponding position on the track. Do this at the start of each round that you remain in that location. If the number rolled is higher than the remaining spaces, place the token on the last space of the track. If you run out of airplane tokens, or if you advance through traffic icon spaces, do not add any tokens. In some scenarios, you'll also see a chart in between 2 positions on the approach track that require you to turn the plane. When advancing through this area of the track, the plane's axis must be in one of the valid positions as indicated by the triangles. Otherwise, you'll lose the game immediately. So you'll have to turn your plane to avoid losing. The game also comes with 6 special ability cards that will help you land your plane. When setting up scenarios that have a star icon, choose the indicated number of ability cards to play with. And feel free to explore using different combinations of abilities to determine which ones are most helpful for you. Next, I'm going to discuss setup instructions as well as any rules changes for each included module, so feel free to jump to the timestamps of the specific modules that you'll be playing with. First, we have the Kerosene Module that requires you to manage your fuel to make sure you don't run out before landing the plane. During setup, place the kerosene track to the left of the control panel and place the kerosene marker at 20. This module adds a new action space that either player can use in order to limit the amount of fuel the plane is using. Placing a die here will immediately decrease the kerosene by the value of the die placed. However, if neither player assigns a die to this track during a round, the plane will lose 6 kerosene at the end of the round. At any time during the game, if the tracker reaches the X space, it means players have run out of fuel and you immediately lose the game. The kerosene track is also used in the Kerosene Leak module. During setup, place the kerosene track as normal, but also place a face-down intern token showing an X on the die space. When playing with this module, you can no longer assign dice to this track, and you also don't lose kerosene at the end of the round. Instead, each round, players lose kerosene equal to the difference between the 2 engine dice plus 1, which in this example would be 4 fuel. Next, we have the Intern Module that requires you to enlist the help of a willing intern and fully train them before the end of the game. During setup, place the intern board below the control panel and place a random face-up intern token on each space. During the game, players may train the intern by assigning a die to their colored space of the intern board. Doing so will allow the player to take the next available token closest to their side and immediately place it on a space that they would normally be able to place a die. They then resolve the effect of the space using the intern token value. Players are not allowed to modify the token by spending coffee and cannot assign the token to a concentration space. In addition, the die you assign to the intern board must be a different value from the next available token. Players must fully train the intern before landing. If there are any tokens left on the intern board by the end of the game, players did not finish the intern's training and lose the game. The Wind module introduces Tailwind that will require players to turn the plane in order to control its speed. During setup, place the blue airplane token inside the wind ring so that the nose of the plane is pointing at the white central space, and place the wind ring to the right of the control panel. During the game, immediately after resolving the axis area, turn the blue airplane token a number of spaces equal to and in the direction of the axis, even if it did not move. The number that the blue airplane token is pointing towards is called the wind speed. When resolving the engines, add the wind speed to the sum of your engine dice, including during the final round. The real-time module adds a 60-second timer to the dice placement phase. At the beginning of each round, start a 60-second timer immediately after rolling the dice. Players now have 60 seconds to place all of their dice and resolve their effects as normal. As soon as the timer is up, the round ends immediately, and any dice that weren't placed are ignored. If any of the 4 mandatory action spaces weren't filled, players immediately lose the game. And finally, we have the Ice Brakes module. In these scenarios, the runway is icy, so you have to deploy special brakes to maintain control of the plane. During setup, place the Ice Brakes board on the control panel, covering the original brakes. The Ice Brakes track works just like the normal brakes, except that players must assign 2 dice of the same indicated value above and below the track in the same round. As soon as you place the opposite die, immediately advance the red brake marker 1 space. This can be done several times in the same round, but unlike the basic game, you must deploy all your brakes by moving the brake marker past the 5 in order to win the game. It's important to note that dice can only be assigned to spaces to the right of the brake marker and in order from left to right. And if the second die is not placed by the end of the round, the first die is wasted. And there you have it! That is how you play Sky Team. If you have any questions about anything that you saw here today, please feel free to leave me a comment down below and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you all so much for watching the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoy content like this and would like to see more in the future, please consider subscribing. Thank you! Bye!